Well, you probably heard the news this past week. On Wednesday, March the 14th, Stephen Hawking passed away. And if you don't know who Stephen Hawking is, then you're not very interested in science, and that's okay. But Stephen Hawking was a very prominent, very highly respected physicist, and he passed away at the age of 76 years old. What's remarkable about that is that Mr. Hawking was diagnosed at age 21 with a form of ALS. And at the time of his diagnosis, doctors gave him 2 years of life expectancy. And he lived more than 50 years after his diagnosis, defying all of the odds. And if you have followed Mr. Hawking's life at all over the years, you've seen that his condition has just deteriorated more and more. And it got to the point where he had almost no use of any of his muscles at all. And he spoke through a device that was created for him that would function by the use of his cheek muscles. The twitching of his cheek muscles would prompt this device to speak for him. It was remarkable, the technology that was used to sustain his life and to help him in his scientific endeavors. He was a theoretical physicist and a cosmologist. And if that sounds like it's complicated, it is. But Mr. Hawking was one of the most respected individuals in his field. But Mr. Hawking was also a very prominent atheist. The headline of this article, and there were others that I could have put on the screen instead of this one, state very clearly in his mind that there is no need for a God to explain this universe. In fact, in this article, where Hawking made it clear that there is no God, he said this: "Before we understand science, it is natural to believe that God created the universe. But now science offers a more convincing explanation." And this is par for the course for people like Stephen Hawking. This idea that if we just learn more about the natural world, if we learn more about the universe, the better we understand it, then the less we need God, the less we need to appeal to something else to explain it, because we're able to figure it out. And so rather, instead of seeing the remarkable beauty and the complexity of the natural world and just the vast size of the universe and saying, wow, someone pretty powerful made this, rather than doing that, we are looking into the complexity of the natural world. We are looking into the vast space of the universe, and we are saying, we've got it all figured out. Here's another quote that I find pretty compelling from Mr. Hawking. Compelling because this quote has inspired and prompted the sermon for this morning. But Mr. Hawking is noted as saying this: "The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge." Think about what he said, particularly the last part of that statement. The illusion of knowledge is the greatest enemy of knowledge. The illusion. When you think you have knowledge, when you think you have understanding, but in reality you don't. That's the greatest enemy to true knowledge. This is the striking quote to me. Mr. Hawking had a brilliant mind, and I am sure that his contributions to science in his field are tremendous. I don't have any doubts about that at all. But despite his brilliance, can I suggest to you that Mr. Hawking succumbed to his own quotation? Can I suggest to you that he operated under the illusion of knowledge? He operated under the illusion of knowledge in the sense that he thought, like so many others like him, the more I can dig into this universe, the more I can understand it, then the less I need some other explanation, the less I need to depend on God. And so the illusion was that God was not necessary to explain the universe. I thought this was kind of interesting about Mr. Hawking. Although he rejects God, obviously, and he rejects the Bible, obviously, according to an article in the New York Times, he did believe, however, that the universe and life have meaning. And we need to figure out what that meaning is. We need to figure out what that purpose is. And so late in his life, he said this to his children, quote, "Remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about what makes the universe exist. Be curious, and however difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at." You see, that quote that he gave to his children, it intimates this idea that there is something out there, some truth, some purpose that we need to find and latch onto. We're not sure what it is yet, but we need to be looking for it. And we need to be looking up at the stars in wonder and amazement, and there's got to be something out there as long as that something isn't God. So I think about what David said in Psalm 19 in verse 1 when he said that the heavens are telling of the glory of God and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. David, the shepherd who spent so many nights out under the stars with those smelly sheep, lying on the grass, looking up into the beautiful sky that God created with his paintbrush. And David says, that tells me that there is a God. And yet that's the opposite conclusion that many are reaching in our scientific communities today. Now we're going to look at Job 28 this morning. And as we look into Job 28, we're going to see some things that Job said. And I believe Job speaking from the position of a philosopher because of some of the things that he says in this book. Job is going to talk to us about man's search for wisdom, man's search for meaning, and trying to make sense of all of these kinds of questions that we ask. Job speaks powerful truths about our search for things of value. He tells us that wisdom and knowledge and understanding, those are the greatest of all treasures. And it is the greatest treasure. Those are the greatest treasures because we don't find wisdom without first finding the fear of God. The Bible will tell us that if we want wisdom and knowledge and understanding, if we want to know what our purpose is and what our identity is, then it begins with the fear of God. And Job helps us see that in this chapter. So let's look together at Job 28. And let's see, first of all, the first 11 verses of this chapter. It's a lengthy reading, but let's look at what Job says to us here about man's search for treasures. Look at verse 1 in Job 28. "Surely there is a mine for silver and a place where they refine gold. Iron is taken from the dust, and copper is smelted from rock." Silver, gold, iron, copper. Metals that you could use either for their precious value, gold and silver, iron and copper, which could be used for more functional purposes, military purposes, for instance, and that would come along later, and tools and other things that you could use iron for. And Job says there are men, and by the way, remember that Job is perhaps the oldest of the biblical stories. The events of the book of Job belong within the time frame of the book of Genesis. So this is a very old book. This is a very old story about a man who's already talking about people who are digging into the earth for gold and silver and iron and copper. These were not unfamiliar materials to them in the ancient world. And Job says, we are mining the earth for silver and for gold. Verse 3, "Man puts an end to darkness, and to the farthest limit he searches out the rock in gloom and deep shadow. He sinks a shaft far from habitation, forgotten by the foot. They hang and swing to and fro, far from men." You see, he's talking about people who are digging deep into the ground to mine for silver, to dig for gold, to search for these precious materials. Verse 5, "The earth, from it comes food, and underneath it is turned up as fire. Its rocks are the source of sapphires, and its dust contains gold." You see, even in this ancient time, people were searching for earth's treasures. digging deep into the ground, searching for gold and silver that they could use to purchase things and to build economies, searching for iron and copper that they could use to build tools and weapons. They were searching for all of these treasures that the earth had hidden for them. These things were not available to them in plain sight. They were not above the ground. You had to dig holes into the ground, big holes. And if you've ever gone through portions of West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky, you can see some of the holes that we have dug to try and get some of these things out. And Job says this is what we do in our search for things that we consider to be treasures. Verse 7, the path that no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud beasts have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. Why don't these animals know about these regions of earth? Because they're underground and it's total darkness down there. And so no animals go down there. There's no purpose for them to dig down that deeply into the ground. They don't care about the gold and silver after all like we do. And so Job says that the animals are not aware of this. Only the humans, only we are digging deep into the earth to try and find these treasures because we see these things as things of value, of things that have worth. We see them as treasures. And so, verse 9, he puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. He hews out channels through the rocks without dynamite, I might add. And his eye sees anything precious. He dams up the streams of flowing water, and what is hidden he brings out to the light. You know, when you dig down into the earth, sometimes you find water. And so when you're digging down into a hole and you strike water, water starts pouring into your hole. You got to stop it before the hole fills up and you drown. And so that's what it means when it says you dam up the waters that are flowing underneath the earth. And he brings to the light hidden things. Those gems, those sapphires, that gold, silver that's been buried into the heart of the earth, it's been hidden. It's been in the darkness, but now it's been found and it's been brought to light. And so men go to great lengths to find these things. We dig into rock. We chisel away at the stone. We dig tunnels. We find underground springs of water. And we do all of this to bring these hidden things to light that we consider to be things of value. But now Job shifts the focus. And he says that those things are not really the greatest treasures of all. Look at verse 12. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? You know, we walk through life searching for these treasures of gold and silver and iron, and we ask, where can the gold be found? Where can the treasure be found? But Job says, I want to tell you about an even greater treasure. And we need to be asking, where can it be found? Now, verse 13 is interesting. Man does not know its value. Why aren't we looking for the greatest treasure? Job says, why is nobody asking about where wisdom can be found and where knowledge and understanding can be found? And the answer is because we don't know its value. And so we will spend our entire lives searching for gold and silver and iron, and we may even come to ruin in so doing. All the while, we have not spent any time searching for the greatest treasure of all: understanding, wisdom. Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. Well, if it's not found in the land of the living, if we don't know where wisdom is, maybe somebody else does. Maybe there's another place that we can find it. And so in verse 14, the ocean speaks up. And the deep says, it is not in me. And the sea says, it is not with me. You see, the ocean speaks, I don't have it. I don't have wisdom. I don't have understanding. Verse 15, pure gold cannot be given in exchange for it, nor can silver be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold or glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for articles of fine gold. Coral and crystal are not to be mentioned, And the acquisition of wisdom is above that of pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Job says you can search the world, you can dig as deep into the ground as you want and find all of the gold and silver and sapphire and treasures that you want. But no matter how much you have, none of that equals wisdom. None of that can be given in exchange for knowledge and for understanding. So, verse 20, where then does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? It's a parallel to verse 12. He's already asked the question there. Where can wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? It's not in the ocean. It's not above the ground. It's not in the land of the living. Where is it? Where can we find understanding? And so verse 21 says, it is thus hidden from the eyes of all living, and it is concealed from the birds of the sky. All right, so if people don't have wisdom, if it's not in the land of the living, and if it's not in the ocean, after all, the ocean did speak up and say, I don't have it, well, then where is it? Verse 21 says, Abaddon, or destruction, and death. Sometimes you read in the Old Testament words like Sheol, the place of the dead. All right, that's kind of a similar idea here. Death is saying, I don't have it either. So it's not among men, it's not in the land of the living, it's not in the ocean. Death has now spoken up and said, I don't have it either. But here's what they do say, with our ears we have heard a report of it. Yeah, we don't have wisdom. We've heard about it. We've heard some people talking about this wisdom thing, but we don't have it here with us. So where is it? Verse 23, Job tells us, God understands its way, and he knows its place. For he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he imparted weight to the wind, and he meted out the waters by measure. Imparting weight to the wind. The wind has power. It's kind of interesting to think about the wind and the force that it contains. I suppose it doesn't have any weight to it at all. I mean, it's just air, right? But then you take enough of it, and it's strong enough, it can blow things over with a substantial force. And so in that sense, it does have weight. And so God determined the weight of the wind, and he gave it that capability. And he meted out the waters by measure. God knows how many gallons of water are on this earth. And it wouldn't surprise him if we were to measure that, and I suppose somebody's tried, if we were to measure the waters and say, hey, we know that there's X number of gallons on the water, God would say, yeah, and I put it there. I know how much is there. I don't need you to tell me that. He's measured the waters. He set a limit, verse 26, for the rain and a course for the thunderbolt. Wow. It used to be in the ancient times that a lot of people thought that the thunderbolts came from Zeus when he got angry. He had a forger up there who was forging thunderbolts, and he'd get mad and he'd throw a thunderbolt down and strike somebody. No, the biblical people understood better than that. Job understood better than that. Well, where did the thunderbolts and the lightning bolts come from? Job says, well, those come from God. Those come from this natural world that God has made. And verse 27, then he saw it and declared it, and he established it and also searched it out. You see, Job is saying God knows where wisdom is. God knows that wisdom is found with him. And we can dig deep into the earth searching for gold and silver and other treasures, but those treasures are meaningless in comparison to the greatest treasure of all, which is wisdom. And that great treasure, wisdom, can only be found with God, because it begins with God. Now look at verse 28, where God says to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Job answers his question here. Where can wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? 2 times he asks those questions, and he gets the answer. The fear of the Lord is where wisdom is found. And when the fear of the Lord causes us to depart from evil, that's when we've gained understanding. when we recognize that there is a being out there who has created all of these things, who's created all of the thunderbolts and the rain and the waters and the stars, and there's a being out there who has created the gold and the silver and buried it deep within the ground. When we understand that, and then it affects the way that we live, that's when we gain the fear of the Lord and wisdom. And so I think about passages like Proverbs 1 and verse 7 that we read at the beginning of our service this morning that says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Turn over to Proverbs chapter 8. Let's look there together. Proverbs 8. The book of Proverbs highlights God's creative activity in this chapter. And it says that God created with wisdom at his side. Look at chapter 8 and verse 22. Now, this is, if you can imagine this, this is the abstract concept of wisdom speaking in these verses. Okay, so wisdom is calling out and saying these things to men. So look at verse 22. The Lord possessed me, wisdom. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While he had not yet made the earth and the fields, nor the first dust of the world, when he established the heavens, I was there. And he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above, when the springs of the deep became fixed, when he set for the sea its boundaries so that the water would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men. Wisdom, God possessed from before the creation. And he used wisdom in the creation, making this world, making this universe, and everything that we see, and even the things that we don't see. God says, I used wisdom in order to do that. Now, what's the point? The point is, as we'll see in the next few verses, if God delighted in wisdom and used it to his advantage, we should be doing the same thing. And so, verse 32, now therefore, O sons, listen to me, listen to wisdom, for blessed are they who keep my ways. Heed instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at my doorposts. For he who finds me finds life, and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who sins against me injures himself. All those who hate me love death. We would do well to seek wisdom, the writer of Proverbs says. And we know from Proverbs 2 and verse 6 that the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. If we want this wisdom, we need to go to God. Because as we saw in Job, he is the source of it. He is the one who gives it, according to Proverbs 2 and verse 6. So wisdom then comes to us from the Scriptures. It comes to us from God's Word. And that's why in our preaching and in our discussions about the Scriptures and about the Word of God, we always say, number one, we need to be spending time in the Scriptures. We need to be reading and meditating on God's Word because this is God's wisdom. But secondly, we need to be spending time with people who have done that themselves. And we need to be talking to people about the Scriptures and talking to people who know the Scriptures because they enrich our lives so much. They help us think more clearly. They help us think more wisely about the world in which we live. Now, go with me to the New Testament. Let's go to the book of Romans. I want to go to chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. There are a lot of men like Stephen Hawking and others like him who try to explain the world without God. And in their wisdom, they feel like they have gained some degree of understanding. Hey, we've got it all figured out. And we may not have all of the answers yet, but we're getting there. And the more we plunge into science, the more we will know. And the more we know, the less we need God. And so look with me at Romans chapter 1 and verse 20 about what God says about this. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and His divine nature, have been clearly seen. Do you see the contradiction in expression in that verse? The invisible attributes of God are clearly seen. How do you see something that's invisible? How do you see the attributes of God, His power and His Godhead or His divinity? How do you see that when it's invisible? Well, Paul tells us in this verse. His eternal power, His divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. This is Psalm 19 verse 1 again. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and the expanse is showing His handiwork. When you see the stars and the planets and the galaxies, you know that some powerful being must be the cause of all of this. And so in verse 21, for even though they knew God, that is, people generally who have turned their minds away from God, even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Psalm 14 in verse 1 says that the fool says in his heart that there is no God. And many people like Mr. Hawking, who profess to be wise, have become fools because they've not sought the true source of wisdom. One more passage. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We'll bring our lesson to a close with this text. 1 Corinthians 1, such a powerful beginning to this letter. The first couple of chapters are so striking and so powerful in their language. And I love what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, beginning at verse 18. For the word of the cross, the message of the gospel, the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. What that passage is essentially saying is that God knew that men would trust in themselves, that they would trust in their own intellect, in their own education and knowledge, and they would be doing exactly what we see people doing today. The more we understand, the less we need God. The more we learn, the less we need some supernatural explanation. And so God knew that we would profess to be wise, that we would become proud in our hearts, and that we would think that we've got it all figured out. And so God said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. If you're so smart, I'm going to craft a message, a gospel message. A message that to all of you educated and wise people who've got everything figured out, you're never going to believe this message. Because in your mind, it's foolish. Because in your thinking, it doesn't make any sense. You can't understand how a man would give his life for the sins of all of the world. How does a man dying on a tree have anything to do to save me from what? And how does this man dying on the cross do that? And so God takes this foolish message as the world sees it, and He uses it to conquer the world. He uses this foolish message preached by 12 weak men to overthrow everything. The foolishness of God is wiser than men. Now, I want to tell you, it brings me no joy to think about the eternal destiny of Stephen Hawking. I pray God has mercy on him. But I can say that Mr. Hawking didn't show God a whole lot of mercy in his life. But it occurs to me that you here this morning and I here this morning, I don't have to wonder about my eternal destiny, and neither do you. You can secure your eternal destiny right now by beginning a new walk with Jesus Christ if you're not a Christian, or by coming back to the Lord if you've left Him. All you need to do is trust and obey. Trust that God is there and that He loves you, and that He sent Jesus to die for you. And think about how great that is, as Alan discussed around the table this morning. But then you need to obey, and you need to serve Him, and you need to love Him. And if we can help you this morning, we invite you to come as we stand and sing together.